In this video, I'm going to talk about attention and how that relates to vision, really how it relates to perception in general. So let's start off and talk about some basic types of attention and some definitions. So selective attention is when we focus on one thing at a time rather than multiple things. Divided attention is when we attend to multiple things. Now, we're much better at focusing on one thing rather than many things. Sustained attention is when we maintain a singular focus for an extended period of time, such as when you're studying or as you're watching this video. But as you probably experienced, it's hard to maintain your attention for long periods of time, and eventually your mind starts wandering. Mind wandering is what we typically call daydreaming. And mind wandering isn't unrelated to attention. So while we try to keep our focus sustained and keep it on what we intend to keep it on, our mind tends to wander quite a bit. Part of that is distracting. But there's value in mind wandering in that it really helps us to consolidate what we're focusing on. Plus, attention is really a limited resource. We can only do it that focused for so long. Right? Maybe when you sit down to study 15, 20 minutes, you're good, and then you'll notice you start losing your attention. Okay? And as you come back to your notes, it'll take less and less time before you start mind wandering. Okay? It's also limited in the fact that we are better at focusing on one thing than multiple things. Overt attention is when we are obviously focused on something. I'm focused on where my eyes are or where my ear is. But we can also kind of be looking somewhere else but paying attention to something that we're not directly looking at. That's covert attention. And we can focus on things that are inside us, outside us, and we can focus on where we want to put our thoughts versus where the world around us directs our thoughts. So a number of things will influence attention. One is the salience of the stimulus. You go into when the pandemic is over, go into a restaurant with a bunch of TVs, and you'll find it hard to focus on the person that you're eating dinner with because the TVs have so many flashing lights and sounds, right? And especially if there's football games or other kinds of sports on the TV, all the cheering and everything else will draw your attention to it. Okay? That's a highly salient cue. Our knowledge of things and experience of things will influence how we attend to things. The more knowledgeable you are about something, the more you'll see and attend to. The nature of the task, right? Some tasks demand more attention, but it's hard to keep that attention for any prolonged period. And even though we may be focused on something, it doesn't mean we're not aware of other stimuli. Okay? Really, you can talk about our conscious and unconscious awareness of stimuli. For the most part, things are happening around us that we really don't consciously attend to. But if we need to, then we will. And we can be looking at something but not paying attention. And as you've probably experienced at some point in studying, you just look things over and over again, but your thoughts are elsewhere. So attention is not about where we move our eyes, it's where we turn our thoughts. Now, truth is, our brain is never at rest. There's always activity going on somewhere. when we're just, not engaged in something, there are certain areas that tend to be more active than other areas, and this is called the default mode network. Okay? This is it's called the default mode because this is where our brain goes by default, right, at rest. It's also the network that's engaged during mind wandering. The attention network actually involves several different types of networks in the brain. Right? Well, in a minute we'll talk about two specific attention networks, but attention also involves other processes in the brain as well. So don't worry about the exact names, just understand that the areas involved in the brain for attention are different than the ones that are involved at rest. Okay? Well, now this is important in that in the process of attention that we may be focused on some goal state. Maybe you're focused on reading. At some point maybe your mind goes off somewhere else, right? And then you become aware of it, and then you have to shift your attention back to where you want it, right? And you're able to do that for a while, and then your mind wanders, everything else. Okay? Now, people tend to see this as a negative thing, but it's just part of how our brains work, right? It's not, certainly people can have some serious problems with this. An example of ADD, but just because your mind does that doesn't mean that you have ADD. Okay? We can only focus for so long, and then our mind is going to wander. For someone with ADD, it's just more extreme than what the rest of us experience. Okay. If you've taken cognitive psych, you may know this model, but this was one of the first theories of attention that was proposed, and it was proposed by a man named Donald Broadbent in 1958. And what he proposed is that attention acts as a filter. Okay? So, in this case, what's happening is we have two messages coming in, one to one ear, one to the other ear. And the participants are asked to attend to only one of those messages. Right? But one message is coming in one ear, one in the other. They only attend to one. Okay? But both are going to come into our sensory stores, into sensory memory. Right? But at that point, once it comes through that into sensory memory, attention begins to filter that. Right? It filters out the unattended and filters in the attended message. We'll talk more about this notion of a bottleneck, but what you see is both are coming in. Right? They're being processed in parallel, but because of attention asking as a filter, now this one's dropping out and we just have one. Okay? Information that comes in parallel is processed real fast. When it moves into serial, this is parallel, if I didn't say that right. Information that comes in parallel gets processed very quickly. Okay? You should know that from the visual pathway at this point. When it moves from parallel to serial, it moves much slower. Okay? And Broadbent referred to this as a bottleneck. And you can think about when you're driving down, say, a 4-lane highway, and it narrows into a 2-lane, or a 2-lane into a 1-lane. If there's traffic, everything's going to move slower. That's the idea of a bottleneck. Okay? And once attention is filtered it out, then we can have higher levels of processing, and we can access that through memory. So for Broadbent, all this was happening unconsciously. It's not till we get to here that things become more conscious. But this is one of the basic ideas of selective attention, that somehow or another it's filtering out unwanted information and letting in wanted information. Alright, so what I want you to do is look through this picture and find the vertical green stripes. Now, that should take you a while to do. Right here. Okay. And it takes you a while to do that because you have to look at each detail one by one. Right? Most of the stripes are horizontal, some are vertical. Okay? But to find the vertical, you have to work through the picture. Okay? And that takes a while. That's the idea of a bottleneck. Right? It slows things down. Whereas if I asked you what this was, you could have quickly told me it's a picture of crosses or something to that sign. You'd have gotten the gist of the picture very quickly. But to find something specific in there takes a while. Anne Treisman was a very prominent psychologist, and she followed up Broadbent's theory of attention with her own, and then later came up with another theory that related attention and perception. And we're going to talk about that second theory in a second. Yeah? Well, that's really what we're going to do right now. So, what Anne Treisman proposed is that we have this binding problem. Our brain processes the attributes of a feature as separately rather than as a whole. Right? So think back to the visual pathway and how things are divided into a what and where pathway, and that different things like our perception of a object, our perception of a face, our perception of the movement of an object, all that is processed separately, okay, as different attributes or features. And yet we're experiencing it as a whole. How it comes together, that's the binding problem. Okay? So, if you go back to the picture, when you're looking for a particular shape, the vertical green stripes, it's a slower serial processing than if you just look for finding the crosses themselves. Right? So she called that a conjunction search. Don't worry about that. I just want you to get the general concept that when you're looking for specific features, it's slower than if you're looking just at the gist of something. Okay? So let me show you the picture of what's here, because it makes it a little easier to explain this from the picture. Okay? So here we have a stimulus pattern. Right? We have green circles, green squares, red squares. Okay? Each aspect, each feature of these things is processed separately. Curvature, depth, motion, orientation, color. Okay? And it's all processed in parallel. Right? If we have to find something specific, right, like the green square, what that means is that we have to turn our attention to each element within that picture. And as we do, what attention does is it brings the separate features together into a whole. Okay? So for Anne Treisman, it's attention that binds these separate features. Okay? And when we do, then we can perceive the object and recognize it. She envisioned attention as a spotlight. If you think about how spotlights work, right? They kind of go out into the darkness, and where the spotlight is, you can see clearly, and where the spotlight isn't, you can't. Okay? So where the spotlight is, everything is found, but on the side, things remain in these separate individual features. Okay? So it's less distinct than what we have here. Alright, you may hear my dogs barking here in a second. Now, what you see, this is primarily a bottom-up process, but attention itself is top-down. Right? So it's us making that attempt to find something, right, top-down process that is creating the binding, right? But also, as it's we have this mutual process between things coming up and our ability to recognize past experience coming in to determine that. Okay, so this is a image that was in the previous presentation, okay, about scene perception. And what we said there is that we can recognize the gist of a scene very quickly, right? We don't have to need to know the details, but we can very quickly say, okay, that's a kitchen. To find something specific in there, right, like the stove, right, we have to use attention to bring it there. And now, yeah, you can see how this parallel process now comes together into a serial processing, okay, creating a bottleneck. So now as I search the picture, it takes longer to find the stove than it did just to recognize this as a scene of the kitchen. But it's attention that allows us to find something. We can, without attention, or without selective attention, just identify the scene very quickly. We talked about different types of movements, and so to find something in a scene, we're typically going to use saccades. Our eyes are going to dart around until we find what we're looking for. And you don't have to know this pathway. I just wanted to show you the complexity of eye movements, all the different areas that are going to be involved in it. Okay? This FEF is the frontal eye field. So this is the the frontal cortex, which is motor cortex. And this is the area that's directs our eye movements, voluntary eye movements. Here's the superior colliculus, which is actually connected to the cranial nerves. These are the nuclei associated with the cranial nerves that actually move the eye. Right? So this says, okay, we want to move the eyes. It sends a signal to the superior colliculus, which then signals to the nuclei for the cranial nerves that move the eyes, and the eyes move. Okay? But you can see all the other areas of the brain that are going to be incorporated into that response. Okay, so when we talk about attention, there's stuff that we voluntarily attend to, and then there's stuff that calls our attention to it. Okay? Endogenous shifts of attention are shifts where we turn our attention to things that are related to our specific goals and interests. Exogenous shifts, so endogenous means in, exogenous means outside of us. So exogenous shifts are external stimuli. I had just know if the dog barking came across on this, but I was focused on here talking, and I had just hit pause for a second, and as I did that, my dog and his friend who's over started barking real loud, and my attention went from the screen to them. Yeah? That was an exogenous shift of attention. Now, we actually have two different systems, and for these two types of shifts, one is a top-down process involving the dorsal frontal parietal system. I'll show you a picture of that. And the other is for when things outside of us draw our attention, and it's called the ventral frontal parietal system. So the dark blue here is the dorsal system. Okay? This is a top-down process. So this is really our prefrontal cortex making a decision. Hey, here's what my goal is. Here's where I want to put my attention. And it sends information from eye fields to direct your eyes towards those goal-directed things in our environment. And That in turn sends information to our visual cortex. Now you can see that this is mutual. You have the visual cortex coming up here, this coming down there. It's because it's directing attention, but it needs feedback from there so that we can continue to direct that attention. If I'm directing my attention to the dogs right now, they're moving. Right? So I have to keep moving my eyes to track each of them as they go. Okay, okay, so that's the endogenous attention system. Then we have a ventral system. Okay? I'm focused at the screen. If the dogs start barking, now this will activate this system, and my eyes will go towards where they're barking. So as you can see, this is a bottom up. All right, this is sending information to here that says, whoa, we need to attend to that. And now I direct my eyes. Whereas this one, the dorsal system, is top down, directing my eyes. Hey, go look at this thing. Okay? There's something else that happens with this system. Okay? So there's some birds at our feeder right now. It's a particular type of bird called a pine siskin. They've been swarming for the last couple of weeks in Georgia. And so I've gotten very attuned to what they look like. But there are many other birds also here. There's cardinals and woodpeckers, there's goldfinches and house finches, nuthatches, etc. There's just a bunch of different birds. Okay? So if I look out at my feeders, there's just a mass of birds. Okay? But if I wanted to find a pine siskin, right, what will happen, because now I've directed my attention for looking at a particular bird, is that it actually changes the way my visual cortex is going to fire, so that I'm able to see that pine siskin easier than the other birds. It will actually stand out despite the fact that it is a crowd of all kinds of birds. So this is top-down biasing by the dorsal system. Okay? It actually changes how the visual areas are processing information to make it easier to see something. Okay? If you're driving in a car with some other people and you're playing punch buggies, all of a sudden VW bugs will stand out more than all the other cars, mostly white cars that are out in the road. Okay? If you're looking for someone in a crowd and you know what they're wearing, say you know they're wearing a red sweater, all of a sudden red sweaters would stand out more. Whereas if you didn't know what they were wearing, the red wouldn't stand out any more than any other color. So the dorsal system biases how those visual areas fire, and we become more sensitive to the things that we're looking at. So you can get the gist of the scene real quickly. Right? You can see the density of things, the lack of kind of straight lines, and know that it's a nature scene real easy. Right? And I could ask you to find something specific. It's real easy to see the dog, but I don't know. I could ask you to find that thing, whatever it is, right? And it would take you a little longer to do it. Okay? But it's as you're focusing on the dog, right? All the features of a dog are bound together by attention, and these are become less distinct. As you turn your attention, say, to the second rock in the creek, right? Now that becomes distinct, and the dog becomes less distinct. All right, attention can go wrong with damage to these areas in the brain. All right, people will actually neglect one whole side of the world. It's called hemispatial neglect. Okay? So they may neglect everything to their right visual field or everything to their left visual field. Right? And typically it's to the right visual field, okay? Yeah, which comes to the, well, it's the left visual field, which is coming to the right side of the brain. Right? And here's just some images of that. You can see how they don't have the numbers on the clock there. Part of the house. They might leave out an eye, bunch up all the numbers on this side, leave that blank. They may only shave one side of their face or only put on one pants legs. Okay? But it can be a real problem. All right. Okay, that's the only one I'm going to show you here, but you may or may not have seen the gorilla. When these guys first started doing the research, about half the people in a class or whatever wherever they were doing this, half the participants would not see the gorilla, and half would. Now, there was no predicting who would see the gorilla, who wouldn't. Okay? This refers to a couple of things. One is kind of the illusion of attention. We think we see everything that's in front of us. Okay? But if you don't see something, how do you know you didn't see it? Right? You only know you don't see something if someone points out to you, hey, you almost walked into that person, or you almost did whatever. Right? Then you become, oh yeah. Totally missed that. Okay? And what happens, because cognition is the limited resource, the more attention we have to pay to something, the more we have to focus on it, the more likely we are to miss something that's right in front of us. Right? And so having to focus on the players in white and neglect the other players as they pass the ball requires a certain amount of attention, right? A certain amount of focus. You're screening one thing out while attending to the other. And so it makes it easy to miss the gorilla. This is also why you should not talk on the phone and drive. Talking on the phone requires a good bit of attention. It doesn't matter if it's Bluetooth or if it's in your hand. The problem is the attention you have to devote to talking to someone you can't see. And as a result of that, you may miss something important. It doesn't mean you can't drive and talk on the phone, because you can. Right? You're so practiced at driving that you can do that with a lot of conscious control. But the attention you need to talk on that phone, whether it's Bluetooth or it's in your hand, takes away from actually being able to see everything that's in front of you. Okay? Now, most of the time, you're not going to notice, right? But if it's a car or someone walking right in front of your car, or another car that's just changed lanes in front of you, and by the time you're aware of it, you may not have time to respond to it. Okay? So it's just best to turn off your phone. And don't try to do both. Okay, so here's the takeaway. We have limits on our physiological and cognitive processes. To compensate for the limits, our systems compensate, for example, by using heuristics. You know, we can get the gist of the scene based on global features. Okay? The compensations work at least well enough, but they're not always accurate and may miss important information. Okay? And we don't have to be that accurate, just accurate enough. Right? And so our heuristics work well enough. Okay? But there are times when we need to be more exact, and that's when we need something more than heuristics. Okay? Our memory of perceptions influenced by more than the stimulus. Right? And it all brings us to another thing. If we're not seeing everything that we're in front of us, if we're not attending to everything, right, is our perceptual image really matching the sensory image?